A quiet fisherman finds something hidden under the ocean waves. And nothing will ever be the same again. What is hiding below the water? Stay with us to find out. Before we start, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. The storm had passed over Crescent Bay like a loud, roaring animal, leaving the sky dark and bruised and the ocean rough. The small coastal town in Maine was waking up slowly to the quiet after all the noise. Waves still crashed against the sharp, pointed rocks, and white foam crawled over the sand like tired ghosts. Ethan Cole walked outside his small wooden house, pulling his old jacket tighter around his body. The salty wind stung his face, bringing the strong smell of seaweed and rain. For many years, he had walked along this part of the coast every morning. His daily walk was as regular as the tide going in and out. But that morning felt different. The storm had been powerful, stronger than any storm in a long time, and the beach looked changed, as if the ocean had decided to rearrange everything during the night. Ethan's boots made crunching sounds on the pebbles and wet sand. All around him were broken pieces of wood, a torn fishing net, and what looked like parts of a boat. The line where sky meets water was still covered in a thin fog, and seagulls flew in circles above, crying out as they looked for food. He stopped to catch his breath. The sound of the ocean filled the silence around him. Then his eyes spotted something strange, half buried in the small rocks ahead. A dull orange shine, long and thick like a coiled snake. He walked closer, frowning. The object was a huge iron chain. Each ring was as big as a man's hand and twice as heavy. The chain ran along the beach for many yards before disappearing straight into the cold gray water. Ethan bent down beside it, brushing away sand. The metal was rough and covered with rust, the kind that only comes from being under the sea for many, many years. He reached out and grabbed one of the rings, feeling how cold it was through his gloves. It didn't move. He pulled harder, digging his boots into the sand, but the chain stayed stuck, unmoving, as if something huge and heavy was holding it from below. A strange, uncomfortable feeling went through him. The ocean had a way of hiding things. But this felt different, too careful, too mysterious. He stood up straight, looking out over the waves, half expecting to see something rise up from the deep. He took a few pictures with his old phone. The chain looked very old, but not like normal shipwreck parts. He had spent his whole life near the sea and had seen ship remains, lobster traps, and the twisted bones of boats long forgotten, but never anything like this. The rings were too thick, the way it was made too careful and exact. He wondered if it had been part of a ship's anchor, or maybe something bigger. His mind wandered to the stories told by the old fishermen in town about wartime ships that had disappeared off the coast, swallowed completely by the Atlantic Ocean. He shook the thought away. Those were just stories, not real things. Still, the uncomfortable feeling stayed. By the time he got back home, the morning fog had started to lift. The sunlight hit the water, turning the surface to silver. Ethan made himself coffee, but couldn't stop thinking about the chain. It seemed wrong to leave it without finding out more, as if the sea itself was trying to show a secret. After walking back and forth in the kitchen, he finally called the local harbor office. His voice was calm, but underneath it was quiet worry. "Found something unusual down by the east shore," he said. "Looks like a heavy chain. Maybe part of a shipwreck." The man on the other end promised to send someone to look at it. Later that afternoon, 2 officers from the Coast Guard station in Portland came in a white pickup truck. Their uniforms were damp from the fog that was still in the air. Ethan led them to the spot where he had found the chain. It was still there, half underwater now as the tide came back in, shining faintly in the gray light. The younger officer whistled quietly. "That's no fishing gear," he said. They took photos, measured how long the visible part was, and radioed their findings to headquarters. The older one turned to Ethan. "You did the right thing calling it in," he said. "We'll need a recovery crew. Might be dangerous. Could be explosives. Could be a collapsed structure." Ethan nodded silently. He wasn't sure why, but hearing the word dangerous made the air feel heavier. That evening, the town seemed to hum with quiet guessing. News traveled quickly in small places, and by nighttime, everyone knew about the chain. Some said it was an old anchor from a cargo ship. Others whispered about submarines, even buried treasure. Ethan stayed away from the gossip, sitting alone on his porch as the moon rose over the water. He felt a strange pull toward that part of the beach, as if something there was calling to him. The chain wasn't just an object. It was a story waiting to be discovered. The next morning, the Coast Guard came back with a small team of divers and equipment. They set up a blocked-off area and studied the tides. Ethan watched from far away, his curiosity fighting with a sense of worry. One of the divers walked up to him briefly. "You the one who found it?" he asked. Ethan nodded. "Then you might have stumbled onto something bigger than you think." The diver smiled a little, but his eyes looked serious. "If this chain leads where we think it does, we might be looking at a piece of history." Ethan didn't answer. The wind picked up, carrying the sound of the waves. He thought about how the sea always gave and took in equal amounts. Maybe this was its way of giving something back, a piece of the past, long forgotten. As he turned to leave, the first diver disappeared under the water. Bubbles rose up behind him. Ethan stood for a long time, watching the ripples fade. The ocean was quiet again, but he couldn't shake the feeling that it was only pretending to sleep. When he finally walked away, the fog was rolling in once more, curling around the rocks like breath. Somewhere below, the chain stretched deeper into the unknown. And though Ethan couldn't see it, he felt its pull like the echo of something very old waiting to be found. By the time the recovery team came back to Crescent Bay, the wind had calmed down, but the sea still moved with slow, tired swells. The Coast Guard boat dropped anchor just off the coast. Its lights shined faintly in the fog. Ethan stood near the beach, his boots sinking into wet sand, watching as the divers got their suits ready. The air smelled of salt and engine oil, and a quiet tension spread through the small group of men. This was no simple rescue job. Everyone could feel it, though no one said it out loud. The ocean held something it had kept for far too long. The divers checked their gear with calm, careful movements. Oxygen tanks made hissing sounds as valves opened, and heavy helmets clicked into place. One of the crew, a tall man with gray stubble on his face, gave Ethan a reassuring nod before turning toward the sea. "We'll find out what your chain is tied to," he said, his voice muffled behind the mask. Ethan nodded back, but couldn't shake the cold, tight feeling in his stomach. As the first diver slipped into the water, the surface rippled once, then closed like a curtain. The sound of the waves swallowed everything. Minutes felt like hours. The sun broke weakly through the clouds, spreading pale gold light across the water, but Ethan barely noticed. The radio at the base station crackled with static and short updates from below. The divers followed the chain ring by ring, going down steadily. At 20 feet, they said there was no sign of anything blocking the way. At 50 feet, the chain got thicker, more covered with barnacles and coral. Then, suddenly, the calm in their voices disappeared. "There's something down here," came the voice over the radio. "Large structure ahead. Metal hull. Broken in two." Ethan leaned closer to the receiver, his heart beating faster. The command officer ordered the divers to move forward carefully. They went slowly, lights cutting through the murky water. What appeared in the beams was both amazing and scary. The outline of a sunken ship resting on its side. Its frame was bent and twisted, but clearly military. The chain they'd been following was bolted deep into its front end, attached to a huge anchor half buried in sand. "It's a destroyer-class ship," one of the divers said, breathing hard over the line. "Looks old. World War II, maybe." A heavy silence followed. Even from shore, Ethan could sense how serious the discovery was. He imagined the ship lying there for many years, unseen, its story forgotten. The divers moved carefully around the wreck. The water grew darker as they explored the twisted hallways. Their flashlights swept over rusted walls and broken windows. Then one voice came through, tight and clipped. "Captain, we've got explosives down here. Lots of them. Shells, depth charges, maybe mines. Some of them look like they haven't gone off." The command post burst into action. Orders flew. Radio chatter got loud. And one by one, the divers were called back to the surface. Ethan watched as their helmets broke through the water, glistening in the sunlight. They climbed back onto the boat, silent and pale. Their faces showed what they had seen. The team leader pulled off his mask and looked toward the shore. "This isn't just a wreck," he said quietly. "It's a grave." The Coast Guard quickly blocked off the area. No boats were allowed within a mile of the site. The local news tried to get statements, but officials kept their findings secret. Still, rumors spread like wildfire through Crescent Bay. People whispered that the ship carried secret cargo, or that it had been sunk by enemy fire. Some said there were bodies still inside. Ethan tried not to listen, but the thought haunted him. At night, he dreamed of the chains stretching endlessly into the dark, leading him down to a silent world of ghosts. The next day, a military transport truck arrived with a team of explosives experts. They set up temporary tents near the beach and started looking at sonar scans. Ethan, pulled again to the beach, stood behind the marked line and watched their work. One of the officers recognized him from the first report and walked over. "You were the first to see it, right?" he asked. Ethan nodded. The officer paused, then added, "Whatever you found out there, it's dangerous, but it's also important. You might have uncovered something we lost a long time ago." As evening came, the divers went back down for a second dive. This time they had cameras and special gear. Ethan stayed at the edge of the sand dunes, watching their lights flicker under the surface like tiny stars. The water was calm, strangely calm, as if the sea itself was holding its breath. When the divers came back up, their faces looked more serious than before. They brought with them pieces of the ship's body, a rusted badge, and something else. A corroded metal plate with faint letters on it. The experts cleaned it gently under a lamp. The name appeared slowly, piece by piece. USS Anchorage. None of them spoke for a long time. The ship had been declared missing in action 79 years earlier, lost during a storm while escorting a group of ships. No survivors. No wreckage ever found. Until now. Ethan listened to the quiet voices around him, the words sinking deep. For many years, families had waited for news that never came. The ocean had kept its secret tight, protecting the memory of the men who never came home. Now, by chance or fate, it had chosen to reveal them. That night, Ethan sat by his window, staring out at the waves glimmering under the moon. The chain was still there, invisible under the tide, but he could feel its weight in his mind. It wasn't just steel. It was history, loss, and the echo of lives cut short. He thought of the divers who had risked themselves to uncover the truth, and of the men who had gone down with their ship, swallowed by the silence of the deep. The storm that had once seemed like destruction now felt like an act of kindness, stirring the sea just enough to bring a buried story to light. When he finally lay down to rest, the faraway hum of the waves filled his small house. He closed his eyes and saw the wreck again, its shadow lying across the ocean floor, waiting to be recognized. And though he didn't know it yet, this was only the beginning. The moment before Crescent Bay would be forever changed by what the tide had chosen to give back. For days after the discovery, Crescent Bay buzzed with controlled urgency. Military trucks came and went. The beach was blocked off with metal fencing and warning signs. The people living there watched from far away, whispering among themselves while the Coast Guard worked with a group of historians and naval engineers. The wreck of the USS Anchorage had stirred something deeper than curiosity. It had reopened a wound that no one remembered existed. Ethan Cole stayed close to the beach, not because he was proud, but because he felt connected to what had been found. He had spent his life beside the sea, and now it seemed to be speaking to him through the echo of this buried ship. Each morning he would walk to the sand dunes and watch the men in uniforms working near the water. Heavy machines rumbled, carrying pieces from the wreck for examination. Military tents stood like ghosts in the fog. One afternoon, a historian named Dr. Rebecca Hall walked up to him. She was middle-aged with windburned cheeks and kind eyes that showed tiredness. "You must be Mr. Cole," she said softly. "The man who found the chain." Ethan gave a quiet nod. She explained that the ship had been part of a secret escort mission during the last months of World War II, carrying ammunition to a naval base off the Atlantic. It disappeared during a violent storm in 1944, leaving 86 crew members unaccounted for. "No one ever knew what happened," she said, looking toward the horizon. Until now. Ethan felt a chill as he listened. The number of lives lost. The years spent buried under the sea. It was hard to understand. He asked whether any remains had been found, but she shook her head. "Not yet. The structure's unstable. We're moving carefully. But even if we don't find them, we can finally close the record." Her words were meant to comfort, yet they carried the heavy silence of loss. Ethan thanked her and stayed at the shore long after she left. The sea was calm that evening, with golden lights spilling across the waves. He thought about those men trapped in darkness, waiting all these years for someone to notice. As night came, a storm grew far offshore, and the rumble of thunder carried over the bay. Ethan went back home, but couldn't sleep. The ocean's rhythm seemed louder than usual, almost like a heartbeat. He sat at his table with a cup of coffee cooling beside him and let his thoughts drift to his wife, Sarah. It had been 10 years since she passed, taken by sickness that left him empty inside. The sea had been his only companion since. He realized, not for the first time, how grief tied people to places, and how memory could anchor the soul as firmly as any chain. Maybe, he thought, that was what the ocean had done, anchored the past until someone was ready to face it. The next morning brought clearer skies and serious news. The explosive disposal team had found several live mines and unstable artillery shells inside the wreck. Work was stopped until the area could be made safe. Soldiers moved with caution, and a temporary evacuation order was placed for nearby homes. Ethan was asked to stay inland for a few days, but he couldn't bring himself to leave. He watched from the cliffs as the technicians worked, their figures tiny against the vastness of the sea. The process was slow, careful, and dangerous. Each object brought up could be a weapon or a piece of sorrow. The men worked silently, knowing that one wrong move could awaken the past in the most violent way. That night, the hum of generators filled the air. Floodlights turned the beach into a pale copy of daytime. From his porch, Ethan saw sparks of movement near the beach where the military teams handled their serious tasks. Then came a sudden flash of light, brief but bright, and his heart clenched. But there was no explosion, only a controlled detonation announced minutes later. The sound rolled across the bay like thunder. He felt both relief and sadness. The sea had hidden danger for many years, and now that danger was being removed, piece by piece. The next afternoon, Dr. Hall came back to speak with him again. She told him that the historians had found old naval records, confirming the ship's last message before it disappeared. A storm had caught them by surprise, and communication was lost mid-message. The captain's final words had been, "We'll hold the line." Ethan stood in silence, staring at the ocean. The phrase stayed with him. It spoke of courage, duty, and sacrifice, all swallowed by the Atlantic. Dr. Hall added that once the site was secure, there would likely be a memorial built for the lost crew. "Your discovery gave them back their story," she said gently. "You've done something good, Mr. Cole." Ethan nodded, though his face stayed distant. He wasn't sure if it was goodness or fate that had led him there. That evening, the weather turned gentle, and for the first time in weeks, Crescent Bay felt peaceful. The warning signs still stood, but the beach seemed calmer, as if the sea itself had found a kind of quiet. Ethan walked down to the edge of the water. The chain was now fully underwater, but he could still sense where it lay beneath the surface. He spoke softly, almost to himself. "You've kept them safe long enough," he whispered. "Now let them rest." The waves lapped around his boots, cool and steady, carrying his words outward. It felt like a prayer. In the days that followed, the explosives were safely removed and taken away. Reporters came to document the discovery, but Ethan avoided them. He had no desire for fame or attention. To him, it wasn't a story about finding treasure. It was about uncovering truth, about giving peace to the forgotten. He often thought of how fragile human memory was, how easily time could bury even the most important things. But the sea, relentless and vast, never truly forgot. It only waited. As the operations neared completion, the military teams began taking down their camp. The beach returned to silence, but the sense of respect remained. Dr. Hall stopped by one last time before leaving, handing Ethan a small laminated photograph recovered from the wreck. A faded picture of 3 sailors smiling beside their ship's railing. "It was wedged in a wall," she said. "We think it survived because it was trapped in an air pocket. Maybe it belongs to someone still waiting." Ethan took the photo carefully, his eyes tracing the faces. "They look so young," he murmured. She nodded, her voice low. Most of them were. That night, Ethan placed the photograph on his fireplace mantel beside Sarah's picture. The 2 images, side by side, seemed to bridge the distance between past and present, between loss and remembrance. Outside, the waves whispered softly against the rocks, and the stars glimmered faintly over the horizon. For the first time in a long while, Ethan felt peace stir in his chest. The ghosts of the deep were no longer restless. And though their story had begun in tragedy, he knew the ending was drawing near. One not of despair, but of light, memory, and the calm that comes when the sea finally gives something back. The last of the military trucks left Crescent Bay under a pale morning sky, leaving behind the hum of the waves and the faint smell of salt and metal. The wreck had been secured, the remaining explosives removed, and the beach declared safe again. The coastline looked unchanged to anyone just passing by, but those who had been there felt that something important had shifted. Where once there had been mystery and fear, there was now respect. Ethan Cole stood at the water's edge. The cold wind brushed against his face, and he felt a stillness he hadn't known in years. The chain that had once glinted in the sand was gone, taken back by the tide. Yet its presence stayed in his mind like the echo of a song that refuses to fade. A week later, the town held a ceremony by the shore. News crews arrived, and officials from the Navy and Coast Guard stood alongside the townspeople. A memorial plaque had been set into a stone marker near the dunes, engraved with the names of the 86 men lost aboard the USS Anchorage. Ethan arrived quietly, taking a seat at the back of the crowd. He hadn't planned to attend, but Dr. Hall had insisted. "You're part of this now," she had said, her tone firm but kind. As the ceremony began, the sound of the ocean served as a gentle background. The mayor spoke first, then a naval officer. Each talked about the courage of those who had served and the many years of silence that had finally been broken. When the list of names was read out loud, the air grew heavy with emotion. Families of the fallen stood with tears in their eyes, holding faded photographs and folded letters. Some had traveled across the country just to be there, drawn by the chance to finally say goodbye. When the time came for the memorial offering, Ethan was called forward. He hesitated, then stepped toward the shore, where a small wooden boat waited with wreaths of white lilies resting inside. The crowd fell quiet. He picked up one of the wreaths. Its flowers were delicate and sweet-smelling. He carried it into the shallow water. The water was icy around his boots. He paused, looking out toward the horizon where the sun was breaking through the clouds in a thin golden line. For a long moment, he said nothing, then whispered softly, "Rest easy, boys. You're home now." With a gentle motion, he set the wreath adrift and watched it glide across the rippling surface. A gust of wind caught it, pushing it farther out, and the sunlight touched the petals until they glowed like tiny lanterns on the water. A murmur spread through the crowd as the sun rose higher, cutting through the fog that had hung around all morning. It was as if the light itself had been waiting for that moment, choosing to appear only when peace had been restored. People looked upward, wiping their eyes, and the feeling shifted from grief to quiet wonder. The sea that had once taken so much now seemed to return something that couldn't be touched, a sense of closure, of forgiveness, of balance. Dr. Hall stood beside Ethan and whispered, "It's beautiful." He nodded, unable to speak, his throat thick with emotion. In the days that followed, Crescent Bay became a place people came to visit because of the story. The town council decided to preserve the beach as a historical site, adding benches and a pathway leading to the memorial stone. Veterans came to pay respects. Families left flowers, and the town's small museum displayed recovered objects from the USS Anchorage. Ethan's life changed little on the surface. He still fished, still walked the same beach, but people began to greet him differently. Some thanked him. Others simply nodded in quiet understanding. He didn't seek attention. He only felt grateful that the sea had chosen him to uncover what it had long hidden. One evening, as autumn settled over the coast, Ethan returned to the beach alone. The sun was sinking low, painting the waves in copper and rose. The memorial stone stood behind him, its words glinting faintly. He walked to the water's edge, hands in his pockets, listening to the rhythmic pull of the tide. The photograph of the 3 sailors that Dr. Hall had given him was tucked safely in his coat. He took it out and looked at it one last time. The edges had begun to fade, but the smiles were still there, unbroken by time. "You're remembered," he murmured. "That's what matters." A soft breeze rose, carrying the smell of the ocean and the faint rustle of seagrass. The waves lapped gently at his feet, as if acknowledging his words. For a moment, the horizon seemed endless and calm, a world washed clean of sorrow. He closed his eyes, letting the wind move through his hair, and felt the strange, comforting certainty that somewhere beyond sight, the men of the USS Anchorage were at rest. The sea that had claimed them had finally given them back to the world of the living, not as bodies, but as memory, as light, as peace. As twilight deepened, Ethan turned back toward the town. The first lamps were flickering on along the docks, casting long reflections over the still water. He thought of Crescent Bay and how it had changed, not through tragedy alone, but through remembrance. People had come together, stories had been told, and the silence that once covered the shore had turned into quiet gratitude. For the first time in many years, Ethan felt that he, too, had found his own closure. The loneliness that had shadowed him since Sarah's passing had softened, replaced by something gentler, a sense of connection to all those who had ever loved and lost to the sea. As he walked home, the sky above him blazed with the last light of the setting sun. The waves shimmered gold, and somewhere beneath them, far beyond human reach, the great chain lay still, its purpose fulfilled. Crescent Bay breathed quietly under the vast sky, no longer haunted, but healed. The ocean, eternal and knowing, whispered against the shore like a heartbeat, steady, forgiving, and alive. And in that sound, Ethan heard what he had long been waiting for. The promise that even the deepest losses could one day find their way back to the surface. The ocean hides many secrets, but some refuse to stay buried forever. If this story interested you, leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. See you in the next story.